Okay, so I am so pleased to be here. It's good to see over 100 of you here right now from all over the world. I can see from the chat. And it's really it's a privilege to be speaking here in this context of the National Library of Israel, which has just been an incredibly important place for me and really a transformative site. If you have not been there before, it is worth seeing. I'm going to be presenting some work from a current book project that literally just could not have even been dreamed of without the Martin Buber archives in Jerusalem. And I remember the first time going there and getting my hands on some of the documents, some of which I'll be sharing today. There was a kind of intimacy with the paper, the handwriting, this sort of material, indirect connection to this person whom I had been studying already for years. There was a kind of closeness that felt almost transgressive at the time. A sense that, like, a sort of disbelief that I was actually able to hold in my hands these unpublished notebooks, these private pages. It's an extraordinary place, and I'm really pleased to be here. So for this occasion right now, I want to share material, some recent material from this current book project of mine. And as a whole, the book is on Martin Buber's representations of Hasidism, that Jewish mystical movement that erupted in 18th century Poland and spread like wildfire therefrom. Buber, himself a towering figure of German Jewish thought, was actually born in Vienna in 1878 and spent most of his childhood in the Polish heartland before moving to Germany only in his university years. Ultimately, despite his own religious anarchism, Buber did more than any other person in history to introduce Hasidism to the non-Hasidic world. Over the course of a half century, Buber transformed Hebrew and Yiddish Hasidic texts into some 1,500 German tales, which he published for broad audiences. I say transformed instead of translated because his renditions were faithful not so much to verbatim language as to what he considered the inner meaning of the sources. In effect, Buber refracted Hasidic texts through the prism of his own religious mind. And this is where I show in my work, I hope, that matters actually get most interesting. As an incisive and creative interpreter of those sources, Buber's readings reflect at once the hermeneutical possibilities within Hasidism itself and his own theological, ethical lens. So drawing upon Buber's unpublished notebooks and the Hasidic volumes in his own library, my book offers an intertextual study of Buber's tales, and just especially because I'm here at the National Library, I want to just share just a couple images. There's a tendency dating back to Gershom Scholem's kind of time-worn accusations at this point that Buber distorted Hasidism. He just sort of wrote whatever he wanted. On some level, of course, it's true, as I mentioned. He was refracting that movement through his own lens. But Buber was also a careful, intimate reader of Hasidic sources. And going through the archives, you get that concrete sense. So this here is one of those like trivial finds. Like, what do you actually do with this? But we see here a receipt. a book receipt from Buber's, one of his many orders of just numerous Hasidic collections, Hasidic books. Here, right in 1915, right in the heart of World War I, ordering, this is just a few here of the cataloged items from the Hasidic collection, ordering books to himself in Germany, where he can pore over these materials. And this here is, this is kind of the bread and butter source that I use in my research. This is it's hard to get a sense from this angle, but this is a fat, just stuffed notebook of Buber's notes while reading through these just mountains of Hasidic books in his library. This is just one page, one example. This is here notes on reading Menachem Mendel of Kutsk, the famous Rebbe. And you just see him going through, marking down the tales that interest him down to the very page numbers. So this is just to give you a kind of visual, sensory impression of the intertextual nature of Buber's project. Yes, he was changing the sources, but he was doing so as a close and careful reader of the Hasidic tradition. So back to my general project and where we're turning to today, thematically, in looking at Buber's interpretations of these Hasidic sources, I focus on themes of embodiment in those writings. Hasidism itself is known for its tendencies to bend the otherworldly elements of medieval Kabbalah down to the earth, as it were. Hasidic concepts of worship and corporeality, avodah b'gashmiut, and a universe soaked in divine presence, along with that movement's radical emphases on community, song, and dance, proved most flammable for Buber's theological imagination. In his anthologies, he isolated and amplified those elements to express what I call in this book Buber's embodied theology. What do I mean by that? Although Buber bristled at questions of theological belief, he sensed that concrete relational events in the world reveal divinity to human awareness in unspeakable ways. There is no objective theological knowledge for Buber. There's only intersubjective knowing, irreducible to any static idea that one could possess or profess thereafter. Fleshly presence itself, where beings face one another, is the very medium of Buber's embodied theology. And his Hasidic tales, often just simple tales about human interactions, capture this non-doctrinal dynamism in ways that no abstract discourse possibly could. Thus, with the help of the National Library, my book follows the paper trails of Buber's neo-Hasidism in order to trace the contours of his embodied theology. But, and this is where I turn to my material for today, but reflections on embodiment can threaten to distract us from bodies. And at times, deep in my head in the library, working on this book, I've been all too aware of this pitfall. Feminist theologians in particular have highlighted this hazard. In the words of Lisa Isherwood and Elizabeth Stewart, what must be guarded against at all costs is the disappearance of the real, lived, laughing, suffering, birthing, and dying body underneath the philosophical and theological meaning it is called to bear. It would indeed be foolish to allow the body to become a disembodied entity, end quote. Moreover, Black womanist theologians have emphasized especially that all bodies are also socially situated bodies, praised and persecuted, fetishized and marginalized, racialized and gendered. In our investigations of Buber's embodied theology, then, we have to ask, whose bodies are present in his Hasidic tales and whose are absent? It's well known that Hasidism came to embrace highly racialized conceptions of Jewishness versus non-Jewishness. Meanwhile, in his own cultural milieu of early 20th century Germany, Buber himself was steeped in discourse about the distinctive Jewish body, although to be sure, he was also writing for an audience of humanist, secular, liberal Jews and Christians. My question in this lecture today is, how did Buber navigate this terrain in his German renditions of Hasidic texts? How did racial anti-Semitism, denigrations of Ostjuden, or Eastern European Jews, and folkish ideologies in Germany shape Buber's interpretations of Hasidic sources? On one hand, through intertextual investigations, we can observe ways in which Buber deracinated Hasidism, uprooting the movement from its geographic and religious cultural particularities in order to inspire his diverse audiences. On the other hand, though, in addition to that deracination, while that surely exhibited universalizing tendencies, I'm going to argue today that this also served to racialize the Hasidic body as a fundamentally Jewish body. In effect, Buber's tales intimated that even assimilated Western Jews might identify with a primal Jewishness that lay beneath Hasidic garments, as it were. So this dialectic of deracination and racialization enabled Buber's Hasidic anthologies to speak to different audiences simultaneously on different wavelengths. To this day, one thing that distinguishes Buber's tales from the vast majority of other neo-Hasidic writings is that his were directed to a largely, if not mostly, non-Jewish audience. Like, what other neo-Hasidic writer could really say that perhaps the majority of their readership is not Jewish? And yet, at the same time, Buber also produced those anthologies very much for Jews, especially in service of his cultural Zionism. This tension in Buber's Hasidic writings, this bivocal nature, is key for understanding Buber's representations of Jewish difference and the Jewish body in his Hasidic tales. From one perspective, Buber's deracination of Hasidim opens up his tales to a very broad audience. Everyone can identify with these Hasidim on some level. From another perspective, though, Buber's uprooting of Hasidism from its geographical, cultural, normative specificity served to reawaken a subsurface pan-Jewish identity that modernity had silenced or eroded in Western European Jews. Deracination and racialization actually go hand in hand. So before we delve into the sources, the Hasidic sources and Buber's tinkering with them, some more just historical background is necessary for us to appreciate this aspect of embodiment in his tales. So to paint the scene in broad strokes here, German Jewish liberals, in their desperate struggles for citizenship and civil rights in the modern nation state, had insisted throughout the 18th and 19th centuries that negative stereotypes about Jews really applied primarily to those vulgar Ostjuden, right? Those Eastern European Jews. This rather tragic deflection worked to some extent, as many German Christians and Jews joined together to throw the Ostjuden under the bus, so to speak, in the name of liberal progress. Such German denigrations of Oriental Judaism intensified toward the end of the 19th century with an influx of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. By 1910, roughly 12% of all Jews in Germany were Ostjuden, and that number leapt to nearly 20% by 1925. In 1923, violent riots erupted against Jews and Jewish-looking people in the Scheinenviertel, a neighborhood of Berlin with high concentrations of Eastern European Jews. And these circumstances aggravated the anxieties of liberal German Jews who wished to both pass as Protestants and contrast their own bourgeois respectability with an imagined savagery of their Eastern European co-religionists. However, such xenophobic defenses didn't work as planned, as racial anti-Semitism took hold. Indeed, Kerry Wallach notes, and I'm quoting here, the idea that the Jews constituted a distinct and also visibly perceptible race took root in the 18th century. Notions of fixed identity, the sense that a person was biologically either Jewish or not Jewish and would remain so regardless of religious conversion, intermarriage, or other attempts to move away from Jewishness, gained traction in the German cultural landscape in the 19th century, end quote. So from this perspective, it did not much matter if a Jew looked like a businessman from Berlin or a butcher from Berdichev. As Stephen Aschheim put it, the new racial anti-Semitism did not distinguish between the cravat Jew and the kaftan Jew, right? The cravat being a sort of cosmopolitan, like fine, bourgeois fashion of the time versus the kaftan, reminiscent of the Hasidic robe. That in this racial anti-Semitism, it didn't matter what you were wearing. Those were simply superficial layers. There is no difference, only dissemblance. In Aschheim's own words, quote, while the kaftan Jew embodied a mysterious past, the cravat Jew symbolized a frightening present. The Ostjude was too primitive, a Western Jew too modern. It was the function of racism to resolve this apparent dichotomy by uniting two Jewries in an indivisible fashion, end quote. Now, in this climate, around the turn of the century, the 19th to 20th century, a younger generation of German Jews rejected their parents' assimilationist aspirations. If Jews embracing their cultural and spiritual heritage meant jeopardizing their political prospects in Germany, then so be it. Many joined forces with a new movement called Zionism, which affirmed constructions of pan-Jewish identity that actually resembled those of racial anti-Semitism, albeit with romantic twists. Indeed, Mitchell Hart points out, the idea that the Jews constituted a race seemed especially attractive to Zionists. Embracing this notion allowed Zionists to redefine the Jews as more than just a collective held together by a common religious faith. They were a people, a folk, in the anthropological sense, end quote. And naturally, this Zionist racialization of Jewishness took on visible aesthetic forms. In her study of Jewish passing in Weimar, Germany, Kerry Wallach notes, many Zionist circles encouraged Jews to take pride in standing out. Liberal Jews, in contrast, were more likely to seek to blend in. So if, as John Ephron highlights, liberal Jews of the 19th century had embraced medieval Sephardic aesthetics in order to differentiate themselves from unrefined Ostjuden, then Zionist German Jews in the early 20th century came to embrace the Ashkenazim of Eastern Europe as if to directly challenge their parents' insecurities. So how does Martin Buber fit into this landscape? Well, he was a prominent leader of this post-assimilationist embrace of Ostjuden and romantic racialization of the Jewish body. And I want to just share my screen briefly again here to just give a visual of this shift here. So this is Karl Buber. This is Martin Buber's liberal, Reform Jewish father. And we see here the son, Martin Buber, as he grew older. So despite anxious pleads from his Reform Jewish father, Martin Buber published popular books of Hasidic tales and identified proudly as a Polish Jew. He grew out a legendary beard that, according to Judah Magnus, made Buber look like a tzaddik with his Hasidim. Or we might say that Buber looked like a perfect hybrid of Eastern European Rebbe and Western European professor. In any case, this became a part of Buber's allure, and he knew it. Believe me, he remarked later in an interview, I would shave this wonderful beard off, but then I would destroy my image. And mind you, this was a time of severe discrimination against Ostjuden and other overtly, quote, Jewish-looking folks in German cities. In fact, it was precisely the decade following World War I when Eastern European Jews became such a conspicuously large percentage of the Jewish population in Germany. That was the heyday of Buber's neo-Hasidic activities. He taught courses on Hasidism at the Frankfurt Lehrhaus throughout the early 1920s. He published major Hasidic anthologies in 1922, 1924, and 1927. Buber's iconic face that Andy Warhol would later capture in a striking print that you should Google if you've never seen it before. So this iconic face, reminiscent of Hebrew prophet, Polish Rebbe, and German Jewish professor, embodied the very pan-Jewish racial identity that he himself helped to construct. The most key term for this in Buber's thought was Urjudentum, primal Judaism. This was the trans-historical, trans-cultural core of Jewishness, which smoldered, according to Buber, in biblical Israel, and then flickered and burned throughout the ages in, and I'm quoting here, in the language of keen intellects and the language of women, in the rejected heretics and the small audacities of the ghetto, just barely aflame until there ignited a movement that stirred the very core of the people, Hasidism. For Buber, primal Judaism, or Judentum, was not some abstract doctrine or idea that was kind of whispered throughout the generations. Rather, it was a wholly embodied way of being. Indeed, another term that he coined to capture this transcultural Jewishness was Seinstradition, being tradition. This, Buber insisted, is so unified with the physicality of Jewish people that, quote, spirit bodies forth, der Geist leibt. And, quote, the values live on in the host who receives them by coming part of his very flesh, sich leiblich eingestalten. Accordingly, Buber asserts the Jew is simultaneously the transmitter of tradition and the word that is transmitted. Quote, tradition is concentrated in the existence, in the Dasein of the Jew himself, end quote. So with this background, with this historical background, we can now appreciate more fully the dialectic of deracination and racialization in Buber's Hasidic tales. In his imagination, Urjudentum, this primal Judaism, traversed even the deepest cultural divides between German Jews and Hasidic Jews. Indeed, it's worth noting that Buber's well-known essay, translated as Hasidism and Modern Man, was in fact entitled Hasidismus unter abendländischer Mensch, Hasidism and Western Man. For Buber, geographical distance was as inconsequential as cultural difference when it came to Jewish existence. Beneath all the garments, whether cravat or kaftan, there churned primal being tradition in the bones of Jewish people. While the deracination of Hasidim made Buber's non-Jewish readers perhaps feel relatively at home, the elements of racialization were hardly lost on his Jewish readers. Secular Zionists identified with the enchanted tales of Buber's Hasidic corpus. Quoting Aschheim here, it provided an alternative channel of folkish identification, a new focus for a positive sense of Jewishness beyond any particular dress or practice. Franz Kafka, meanwhile, was apparently frightened by the implicit appeal to folk solidarity born by Buber's Hasidic tales. Within Buber's dialectic of deracination and racialization, when one peels away the cultural trappings of Hasidism, one beholds the unmediated body-soul of the Hasid, which is also, for Buber, the hidden, suppressed body-soul of the Jew. Buber sought to penetrate beyond the outer trappings of Hasidism. He recalls his own youthful intuitions of what lay beyond the showy splendor of the court, the petty magic of the rebbes. On the outside was darkness. This is like this motif of darkness in his descriptions of Hasidim, kind of from an outside perspective. He refers to the dirty village of Sadagora, where he first beheld the Hasidim, the dark Hasidic crowd cradled in the dark, despised East. And Buber sought to unleash the hidden light, the Or Haganuz, from inside, which was that spark of Jewishness itself. This was his uplifting of the sparks, to use a Hasidic image. His revelation of Jewish luminosity under layers of regional drag. And the uplifting of the sparks was profoundly hermeneutical. And so I want to turn now, hermeneutical meaning rooted in his interpretations of Hasidic texts. So I want to turn now to this intertextual space, this intersection of Buber as a reader and as a writer, and the Hasidic sources that he was studying very, very closely. So how does he represent this Hasidic person, the Jewish body in this particular incarnation of Hasidic culture? And my work focuses primarily on Buber's later Hasidic writings, which is the vast majority of his Hasidic writings, really starting in the post-World War I year, inaugurated with his 1922 anthology on the Maggid of Mezrich and his followers, and going through the very famous magnum opus, Tales of the Hasidim, released in the 1940s. But just a word about Buber's early Hasidic writings is helpful here as well for looking at representations of the Jewish body. In these early anthologies, and thinking especially of his book on the Baal Shem Tov, the Legends of the Baal Shem Tov, published in 1908, Buber exhibited just a stunning refusal to let the Hasidim speak for themselves. These are just fancifully, wildly imaginatively rewritten, reimagined Hasidic tales. When people talk about Buber completely distorting Hasidic sources, it's really these early works that they should have in mind, at least. I'm thinking here of the notion of what it means to let the subaltern speak. This phrase of Gayatri Chakravarti's Spivak, and this notion that in Spivak's own analysis, that the colonizer is transforming the voice, refracting the voice of the colonized in order to let them be visible in some sense. And when we're turning to, but of course there's an epistemic violence to that. When we're looking at Buber's representations of the Hasidim, of course, this isn't a colonizer and colonized looking at a German Jew and an Eastern European Hasid. But in light of some of that history we were tracing, there are the structures of power and the processes of what it means to get citizenship, what it means to be affirmed as a part of this nation state or this empire, or to sort of fix an Orientalist gaze on the other, certainly bears some structural similarities. And what we see in Buber's early tales is his need to just transform, to utterly transform the Hasidim as they appear in the tales themselves. We have in one tale in his anthology on the Baal Shem Tov, the so-called founder of Hasidism, he literally describes, not pulling from the Hasidic source, but in his own words, describes the Baal Shem Tov as having light brown hair, right? Going out of his way to emphasize the lightness, almost the near blondness of this Baal Shem Tov. And he just writes repeatedly to capture a sort of handsomeness and a powerful like beauty and grace of the body of the Baal Shem Tov, how delicately the large and obviously strong man moved, I'm quoting here, how he walks light-footedly and yet rushes, pushing like a swimmer. Buber refers to this gorgeous man. His smile was like that of a sea which rests between cliffs, indulgent, smiling from its base upward when the setting sun caresses it. There's an almost like erotic, fetishized quality to these early descriptions of the Besht and the Besht's body, evoking what we associate with a kind of Nietzschean ideal of the Aryan man. Buber really, in his early works, just sort of transforming the textual Hasidic images of Hasidim into this very Germanic ideal of the sort of the optimum earthly, spiritual, vital human being. And in these works, in these early works also, Buber is really erasing, omitting almost all references to Jewish ritual activity or just sort of overtly culturally specific images in these tales. So what is the Hasidic body, right? What is the Jewish body that Buber is manifesting in these early works? It's a kind of Germanic body that has this like Oriental je ne sais quoi that imbues it with like something else, some spark that could be recovered. Now, turning to Buber's later Hasidic writings, again, the vast majority of his writings of Hasidism, we see a strikingly new interest in actually letting the Hasidim speak for themselves. Just opening one of these later anthologies, a reader will immediately notice that the tales are much shorter, they're sparser, they're less flowery than the original Hasidic anthologies. They look more like German translations of the original sources. It's not quite that simple, but in a way, to use that Spivak's language, Buber is clearly trying in some way to let these subalterns speak, to let these denigrated Ostjuden, to let their voices be heard and to let their bodies be seen in some ways through the language of these later tales. And Buber sees this as explicitly notes that this for him is an ethical shift in his writings. he says that in his earlier years, he did not listen attentively enough to the crude and ungainly, but living folk tone, which could be heard from this material. He had paid all too little attention to its popular, volkstümlich vitality as the Western author that he was. And we see here, predictably then, much more vivid graphic images in these tales of the sort of Hasidic religious culture, of ritual, and of more culturally specific elements in general. And of course, a less apologetic recasting of the Jewish body. That language of light brown hair and virile strength, right, that we see in his earlier anthologies, we don't really see that anymore, starting in the 1920s in Buber's anthologies. And this is a part of Buber's well-known shift from mysticism to dialogue. This is him trying to have a more dialogical connection to these Hasidic sources, to actually see them in their otherness, as opposed to fully unifying himself with them. But it's also, of course, a response to the historical shifts that we were looking at before, with the increased visibility of Eastern European Jews on the streets of Berlin. It wouldn't have been quite as convincing to his readership to paint this highly idealized portrait of the Hasidic Jew, of the Eastern European Jew. And also, given Buber's shifts in this time that we mentioned before, the idea that he should even have to do that he should have to sort of reimagine this body for German audiences became increasingly repugnant to Buber. This reminds me of comments that Fanon makes in his book Black Skin, White Masks, where he notes that actually when I fall into this sort of romanticizing of the sort of enchanted Black man, right, or the enchanted African, that Fanon says I'm falling into the gaze of the white colonist, right? I am falling into this binary of white supremacy, of white versus Blackness. Even when I'm romanticizing Blackness, I'm falling into that. I think we see a shift here that's somewhat analogous for Buber, that he shouldn't have to idealize and transform the Jewish body to the same degree. But I do not want to overstate the lack of apologetics here. Right? Buber continues to change these sources. He continues, and what I want to look at today, he continues to scrub the sources clean of xenophobia, ethnocentrism, and a kind of highly racialized thinking, racialist thinking in the Hasidic sources themselves. And here we're really zeroing in on the kind of deracination, one element of the deracination in Buber's Hasidic tales. So at times, he will, for example, omit language in these sources that highlight tensions between Jews and Christians in the Hasidic landscape. A good example of this is a tale that he calls Shaul and Ivan in his section on the Baal Shem Tov in his later anthologies, in Tales of the Hasidim, where in the original, the Baal Shem Tov brings this child into this town, and it's noted explicitly in the original sources Buber consulted that there is Christian violence in this town. And there's this whole story that revolves around this child, Shaul, also called Moshko in the original source and in some versions, who's having these interactions with this kind of lineup of Gentiles with sort of quintessentially Gentile names that's almost like laundry listed in a sort of humorous way in the original Hasidic tale. and this sort of dangerous connection, and they're very rude to him. And in Buber's version, he omits the stuff about this being like a dangerous place, a site of massacres, and he really makes the portrayal of the non-Jews in this tale far more friendly and smooth and almost affectionate in ways that betray the original source. So at times we see him kind of softening the social boundaries and social clashes between Jews and non-Jews in these tales. But oftentimes there is simply an erasure of Jewish difference. And this is, I think, even more interesting in some ways. So there's certain terminological changes that Buber makes in these tales very consistently. So for example, the word goy, right, Gentile, non-Jew, the word aral, an uncircumcised person. These are terms that you see fairly frequently in the Hasidic books, the collections that Buber is reading through in his library. And very consistently, he translates goy or aral, these references to non-Jews, simply as bauer, which can mean a farmer, can mean a peasant, but not necessarily a non-Jew. Similarly, a phrase that comes up in the Hasidic tales quite frequently is the term ahavat Yisrael, love of Israel, love of the Jewish people. Buber repeatedly translates this as Liebe zu den Menschen, the love of human beings, the love of people. And we see this happen repeatedly, and there's plenty of examples we could look at. So those are ways that he's altering the sources to sort of almost dissolve the distinction between Jews and non-Jews in these tales, in this kind of blatant deracination of Hasidism in its own social landscape. And of course, also just in his principle of selection, right? Buber, again, has like 1,500 of these Hasidic tales that he renders in German. But there's a hell of a lot more than that in the Hasidic collections he's reading, right? He filters out the vast majority of the Hasidic tales, and we see in looking through the pages that he skipped, looking at the tales that he did not mark in his personal notebook, that he, through his principle of selection, also facilitated this kind of deracination of Hasidism in skipping a lot of the tales that were more overtly sort of particularistic or ritualistic and so on. And this observation of dynamics in Buber's tales it's been noted for a long time. Already back in 1918, Jakob Klatskin remarked that this modernized Hasidism in Buber and in others is what he called it an emptying out of all Jewish content or Jewish form, much like 19th century Jewish assimilation. Klatskin calls this modernized Hasidism, quote, an ideological surrogate for a de-Judaized life. And that perspective on Buber's Hasidic writings continues to be echoed through today. But I want to nuance that conclusion. That I want to say that this deracination didn't only universalize and de-Judaize Hasidism. Actually, this deracinating also served to racialize Hasidism or Hasidim so that all Jews, even the most assimilated, could identify with them. So this, from this perspective, on one hand, with say the translation of Bauer, right, the translation of goy to peasant. On one hand, this could say that everybody could simply be seen as human. But on the other hand, it means that everyone in these tales could be seen as Jewish, right? That the former Gentile is now perhaps able to be regarded as a simple Jew in a Hasidic story. And Ron HaKohen has noted this as well, that at the beginning of the 20th century, I'm quoting HaKohen here, when Buber started publishing his adaptations of Hasidic texts, there were certainly Jewish Bauern, there were certainly Jewish farmers, both in Europe and in Palestine. Buber's Bauer is not described explicitly as either a Jew or a non-Jew. His group identity is simply left open and is entirely irrelevant in this text. So I want us to look together at an example of this, where we can see Buber changing the identity from Gentile to farmer or peasant, but actually ways that this deracination also serves a dynamic of racialization. So let's look at a source together here. Okay, I apologize for this is a lot of text. It's a fairly long story, but it's a good one, and it's worth us looking at here. So this is the original text, and I've tried to translate it as sort of hyper literally as possible here from the Hebrew to give us a sense of the text that Buber himself was looking at. This is a story about how the great Maggid of Mezrich, one of the foundational figures of early Hasidism, became a disciple of the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Classidism. So here's the tale from the book Keter Shem Tov. I heard from one Chassid about when the holy Rabbi Buber, the Maggid of Mezrich, first heard of the great name of the holy Rabbi, the Besht, an acronym for the Baal Shem Tov. All the people were journeying to the Besht, and he enacted great and wondrous actions in his prayers. Now, Rabbi Buber was sharp, prodigious, and expert in all the Talmud and all the legal commentators, and he was exceedingly knowledgeable in the wisdom of Kabbalah. So he was amazed by what he heard about the high level of the Besht. At one point, his mind was set to journey to the Besht in order to test him. But he was so diligent in his studies that when he was on the road day after day, unable to persist in his studies as he could at home, he started to regret the journey. Later on, when he arrived to the Besht, may his memory live in the world to come, he thought that he would hear Torah from him. But the Besht told him a story about how he had journeyed on the road for a few days and did not have any more bread to give to his uncircumcised wagon driver. And then a destitute Gentile happened to arrive with bread, and the Besht bought bread from him in order to compensate his uncircumcised wagon driver, and other stories like this. Then on the second day, Buber came again to the Besht, and the Besht told him how when he was on the road, he did not have any more hay to give to the horses, and then a destitute Gentile happened to arrive, etc. Now, all the stories that the Besht told contained great and wondrous wisdom for one who understands, but Rabbi Buber did not understand this. Thus, he went to the guest house and said to the servant, I wanted to journey back to our place today at once, but it's really dark out, so let's stay here until the moon rises and sheds light, then we'll set off on our way. And it happened that at midnight, as Rabbi Dov prepared himself for the journey, the Besht sent his servant to summon him, and he went to the Besht. The Besht asked him, are you able to study? Yes, he responded. And the Besht said to him, do you have knowledge in the wisdom of Kabbalah? Yes, he said to him. And the Besht said to the servant, bring me the book, Et Chaim, Tree of Life. The Besht showed a passage in Tree of Life to Rabbi Buber. Rabbi Buber said to him, behold, I will contemplate and ponder this. Then he told the Besht the pshat, the plain meaning of this passage. The Besht said to him, you don't know anything. Buber reviewed the passage and contemplated it, etc., and said to the Besht, the correct pshat is as I said. If one knows a different pshat from his excellency, then he shall tell me, and I'll listen to whoever has the truth. Stand up on your feet, the Besht said to him, and he stood. Now, in this passage of the Tree of Life, there were some names of angels. And immediately when the Besh spoke this passage, the entire house was filled with light and fire flamed all around. And they saw with their senses, sensorially, the angels mentioned. And he said to our holy teacher, Rabbi Dov Ber, it's true that the pshat is as you said, but your studying was without soul. Suddenly and immediately, Dov Ber commanded his servant to journey back home. And he stayed there with the Besht and studied with him great and profound wisdoms. So there's a lot we could say about this story, but what I want to highlight is that for the original, what we see here is Dov Ber, right? The Maggid of Mezrich is this very bookish scholar. He's super erudite. He knows his Talmud. He knows his Kabbalah, and he assumes that what the Baal Shem Tov can offer him is some new interpretation, some new like textual knowledge, some new Torah. But when he gets to the Besht is telling him these seemingly mundane stories about interactions with non-Jews, right? An uncircumcised wagon driver, a poor Gentile who comes and his interactions with them. And Dov Ber just thinks this is nonsense. Like, why are you even telling me this? But what we know about Hasidic theology is that when the Besht is telling these stories, and when it says that these stories had great and profound wisdom that Dov Ber couldn't understand, that great and profound wisdom, what we know from Hasidic theology, is that the Baal Shem Tov is showing Dov Ber like these are places where I uplifted holy sparks from mundane corporeal existence. These were merely non-Jews, right? These were the husks, the klipot of reality, and I was descending downward into these places to uplift holiness, to bring the light out from these dark places of mundane reality, of this non-Jewish mundane face of existence. And then in the climactic moment, when the Baal Shem Tov reads this passage from Eitz Chaim in a way that makes angels and light and fire sort of erupt in this house, he's on some level doing the same thing with text. He's showing Dov Ber a way of uplifting the sparks. In this case, a way of tapping into the divine light, the divine life force that is throbbing within the corporeal material letters themselves. Not some new heady interpretation, but a way to actually penetrate into the black fire, if you will, right? The dark matter of text, and to open it up and unleash the divine energy that had been concealed in those letters. And so when Dov Ber stays, according to this tale, to continue studying with the Besh, he's going to learn these contemplative techniques, these meditative practices, these ways of uplifting the sparks in mundane reality, in the letters of texts, and so on. Now, Buber transforms this text in striking ways, and I want to just look at some of the ways that he does it. For Buber, this is a different kind of teaching that the Baal Shem Tov exhibits and introduces the Maggid to. So whereas the original says when he arrived to the Besht, when Dov Ber arrived to the Besht, he thought that he would hear Torah from him. Buber changes this to when he reached the master's house and stood before him, he greeted him. And then without even looking at him properly, Buber adds this line, ohne ihn auch nur recht anzuschauen, without even looking at him properly, waited for teachings from his mouth that he might examine and weigh them. So already Buber is like sort of injecting this tale with a sort of bodily manifestation of how unattuned Dov Ber is to another human being, right? He just wants to get back to his studies. He wants to use the best essentially for some new knowledge, but instead, and he's not even looking at this human being before him. And this proves crucial for Buber. Again, this is the original here, but the Best told him a story about how he had journeyed on the road for a few days and did not have any more bread to give to his uncircumcised wagon driver. And then a destitute Gentile happened to arrive with bread, and the Best bought bread from him in order to compensate his uncircumcised wagon driver. Buber changes this to, but the Baal Shem only told him that once he had driven through the wilderness for days and lacked bread to feed his coachman. Then a farmer, or a peasant, a bower, happened along and sold him bread. So if for the original, this was about going into this like mundane dimension of the world of corporeality represented by non-Jews in this highly sort of racial Hasidic ontology. For Buber, it's not about that. It's about interacting with human beings. The Baal Shem Tov is looking at this scholarly guy who's not even looking him in the eye and telling him stories about human interactions. That's what's essential for Buber. And again, this bower, this kutcher, to the reader, the new reader who's discovering Hasidism through Buber, likely imagines that these are other Jews. Again, then on the second day, this is the original source, the Best told Doveber about how when he was on the road, he did not have any more hay to give on the horses, and then a destitute Gentile, a goy, happened to arrive, etc. Again, we see predictably that that Buber just, instead of goy, is using bower again, farmer. All of the stories that the Best told contain very wondrous wisdom, but Rabbi Doveber did not understand it. That's what the original says. Now, how does Buber change that? The Maggid did not understand what the tales were supposed to mean to him. Im, right? Buber just adding that one word to him at the end of the sentence is suggesting that what the Maggid fails to understand in this interaction is not some esoteric wisdom about uplifting the sparks from the corporeal husks of reality represented by the non-Jews in this story. Rather, what the Maggid fails to understand is a certain way of listening. The Maggid is only listening in terms of himself, what he's going to get out of this story. And it's precisely for that reason, according to Buber, that the Maggid fails to understand. So at the climactic moment, let's just skip to here, when the Baal Shem Tov is going to sort of convert the Maggid, enlighten the Maggid in some way. In the original, the Best says, "Stand up on your feet." The Best said to him, and he stood. For Buber, stand up. The Maggid stood up. The Baal Shem stood over against him, im gegenüber, which is this key term in Buber's whole philosophy of dialogue, this gegenüber, of being over against, across from somebody as the posture of dialogical encounter. And it's worth noting that in one of the other versions of this tale that we know from his unpublished notes, Buber also consulted, this climactic moment of the tale actually took place where the Best positions Doveber lying kind of in a circle on a bed, right? So a posture that is super different from standing over against somebody. But Buber adds this posture into the tale, and in a similar spirit, whereas the original source says, "And he said to our holy teacher, Rabbi Doveber, it's true that the pshat is as you said, but your studying was without soul." Buber's Baal Shem Tov stood over against him, again, im gegenüber, and said, "The interpretation that you said is correct, but you have no knowledge, for your knowledge has no soul," right? It's not some new way of studying, some new way of engaging with letters that Buber's Best is trying to teach here. It's a new way of knowing, one that is attuned, that looks someone in the face, that faces other human beings in the way that the Best had been trying to convey through his language of these interactions with, for Buber, just other people. So we see here that, that in Buber's tale, very differently from the original, this is a story of what it means to live Hasidic religiosity. And to do that is to be interpersonally engaged, right? It's not about going into the darkness of like the non-Jewish world and the descent for the sake of the ascent and to go unlock the light in those places. For Buber, every character in the story seems, at least possibly, to be Jewish. This is sort of a utopian Jewish landscape where the Baal Shem Tov is teaching Dov Ber what it means to look someone in the eye and what it means to not just use a person for knowledge or interpretations or information, but to actually meet another human being. So the magical, almost shamanistic quality of this moment in Buber's imagination is rooted precisely in the bodies of these Jewish people who can see each other and interact with each other in a particular way. For the sake of time, and I'm going to be curious to hear your questions, I'm just going to skip for just to one last text before closing. To highlight some of this dialectic of deracination and racialization in Buber's tales. And it's a story that the German Jewish intellectual Shalom Ben Chorin tells about a moment in Buber's life with one of his Hasidic anthologies. And we'll just look at it together here. Okay. Moving from that spacious, cultivated house on Bergstrasse in Heppenheim, this is referring to 1938, when Buber is about to flee Nazi Germany to Jerusalem, to Palestine. Moving from that spacious, cultivated house on Bergstrasse in Heppenheim, it's the town where Buber lived in Germany, posed a not so simple technical problem, as Buber presided over an expansive library of more than 20,000 volumes, which now had to be packed carefully into boxes. The authorities of the Third Reich mistrustfully sent a Gestapo officer to supervise the packing of the library and the rest of the household. Buber described vividly how this officer, clearly not one of the malicious ones, stood idly and bored in the book Chaos, and finally turned to the head of the household with a request to pick out a volume for him to read. Buber told the uninvited guest to select any book, whereupon the Gestapo man responded, "Herr Professor, I would very much like to read one of your works." Buber hesitated a bit, as it was not entirely clear to him which of his books would be suitable now for the Gestapo. And finally, he handed to this officer of the secret state police the thin paper edition of his Die Hasidischen Bücher, this big volume recently, or actually like a decade earlier, published of Buber's Hasidic tales. Within 3 days, the fascinated Nazi read through the more than 700-page work in its entirety. And what happened now was least expected. The Nazi police officer asked Buber, "May I keep this book as a souvenir?" And when Buber said yes to this, the Gestapo man requested a personal dedication. When Martin Buber narrated this to me, he added with laughter, "I could not very well write, 'My dear Gestapo man.'" Buber solved the dilemma by simply signing the volume. So a question, of course, that comes up here is, in this moment of deliberation, when Buber is standing there in his house in this book chaos, surrounded by his tens of thousands of volumes, and when this Nazi officer asks him for one of his books, and Buber thinks which is the book to give him, he chooses a Hasidic, one of his Hasidic anthologies. And the question in my mind is why? Why that book? Was it a safe option because of a sort of humanistic, universalized, deracinated world of the Hasidim that would be kind of like a safe territory for this Nazi to be reading next to him? Or was it subversive, right? Was this as if to say, I am a part of these denigrated Ostjuden. I am one of these foreign alien Jews, and I'm damn proud of it. Right? Was this a safe or a subversive option when Buber handed this Gestapo officer a copy of Die Hasidischen Bücher? And I'd like to suggest that it was both, right? That we have this dialectic of deracination and racialization in Buber's Hasidic tales that put Buber's thought and into this kind of fruitful ambiguity, where he is trying to craft an identity that is deeply human and deeply Jewish at the same time. And we see manifestations of that in Buber's of that tension and that dialectic in Buber's politics, in his relationships, and here in his Hasidic tales. So I'm gonna stop there, and I really look forward to questions and discussion. So thank you so much for bearing with me here.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Shonkoff. There are many questions in the chat room. I will have to skip a few. I apologize in advance. But the first question is, did anyone from the Hasidic world write anything about Buber or in response to his work?
That's a great question. So it's interesting. One would not be caught dead with a Martin Buber book on your shelf, generally, in the Hasidic world. This is taboo literature, right? This is, but that same scholar, Ron HaKohen, who I mentioned before, who wrote about the image of the Bauer, the peasant or farmer, in Buber's tales, did some investigative research and actually has shown that there have been a number of publications in the ultra-Orthodox world, including in Hasidic publications, that have plagiarized Buber's Hasidic tales, especially from his modern Hebrew version, or Haganuz, and actually plagiarized some of Buber's Hasidic tales just within the context of Hasidic literature, which I think is fascinating just from like a human interest cultural standpoint. It also, however, I think shows something about neo-Hasidism and Buber as a neo-Hasidic thinker. In fact, when you look at Buber's later Hasidic tales, again, the vast majority of Hasidic writings, he has this strong reputation of completely distorting and turning upside down the original Hasidic sources. But actually, the changes that he was making were oftentimes not necessarily more conspicuous or more overt than the kinds of changes you see across individuals and across generations of Hasidic writers and editors within the Hasidic milieu. So I'd say what makes Buber's tales neo-Hasidic is first and foremost the fact that, just sociologically speaking, he was not a Hasid. The fact that he was not a Hasid himself, but drawing upon Hasidic literature, is what it means when we say that Buber was a neo-Hasidic writer. Did he have ideas that were also very much from outside of the fold of Hasidic doctrine and culture? Of course, and that's also a part of it. But the extent to which those ideas transformed the original sources was not always as noticeable as some have found. And also Hasidism itself, Hasidic literature itself is far more dynamic and changing and evolving than many would like to think. And so I am not familiar of like divrei Torah or essays out of the Hasidic world about Buber's writings, engaging with his writings. If anyone has any, please reach out to me and send them to me. But in terms of evidence that Hasidim were in fact reading Buber's tales, however secretly, and even drawing from them and plagiarizing them, to use the word of Rana Cohen, we do have evidence of that.
Thank you very much. Mark just wrote outstanding, and he asks, what is the title of your book?
TBD, but I think at this point, the tentative title is Sacramental Existence, Embodiment in Martin Buber's Hasidic Tales. And like I said at the beginning, most of this book is looking at the embodied theology and religiosity that Buber articulates out of the sources of Hasidism. And this chapter I'm working on right now is looking specifically at how bodies are gendered and racialized in those tales, which I see as an important facet of this project as well.
Thank you very much. Nomi asked, how did Buber deal with the Dreyfus Affair?
Well, the Dreyfus Affair famously was a landmark moment in the origins of Zionism, especially famously, legendarily in the person of Theodor Herzl. Buber's approach to those moments of anti-Semitism in European politics, he was, of course, changed by those moments. They impacted his thinking. But in contrast to someone like Herzl, the political Zionists, like Buber speaks especially about kind of Theodor Herzl and Leo Pinsker, as their Zionism is first and foremost a response to anti-Semitism. For Pinsker, it's the pogroms. For Herzl, it's the Dreyfus Affair, and these are the moments that prove for this strain of political Zionism that the Jews need a nation state, right? The Jews need their own nation state, and that is the takeaway from these moments. Buber himself, in his own Zionism, in his own so-called cultural Zionism or spiritual Zionism, was actually opposed to the project of creating a Jewish nation state, although he was passionately envisioning a cultural, spiritual renewal of the Jewish people in ways that were also bound up with the place of Palestine, the place of the land of Israel. But events like the Dreyfus Affair were in ways that were purposeful, not really figuring centrally in Buber's approach to Zionism. He was less interested in a response to anti-Semitism and letting anti-Semites determine the forms of Jewish life and identity than he was in tapping into the sources of Jewish tradition and Jewish culture itself to animate what would happen for the future of the Jewish people.
Thank you very much. Nomi also asked, who were the non-Jewish readers who read Buber? Were they German? Do we know what drew them to Buber?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question, Nomi. Hermann Hesse, the author of Siddhartha, for example, nominated Buber for a Nobel Prize in Literature based on his Hasidic tales. He had an enormous non-Jewish readership, and again, it might have actually been the majority of his readers in the German language of his Hasidic tales. prior to his publications of these anthologies of Hasidic tales, he had published other anthologies that were not specifically for Jewish audiences. He had really made a name for himself with books like Ecstatic Confessions, that was a collection of mystical testimonies from traditions throughout the world, including a couple from the Hasidic context, but really a kind of world religions, banquet of ecstatic confessions. He published collections of Chinese tales and folk tales from different traditions throughout the world, and this was very much in vogue at the time. He was a writer of this kind of neo-romantic counterculture that was a broad movement, especially among younger people of his time, and that was his readership. It was only later, subsequently, that he started publishing these collections of Hasidic tales, and in many ways his readership remained, right? The people who had been reading his folklore we're also reading these sources, and especially given the historical context that I was painting with the influx of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe into the cities, streets of Germany, right? It became increasingly interesting to a lot of people to say, like, what the hell is Hasidism, right? What is this? And to say, oh, Martin Buber actually has been publishing these collections of tales. That's just a little glimpse into his non-Jewish readership.
Thank you very much. Again, I apologize to those who wrote questions who I'm going to skip over. Ken asked, could you please expand on Kafka's reaction to Buber's interpretation of Classidism?
Yeah, so I mentioned at one point in the lecture that Kafka was uncomfortable with what he saw as a sort of folkishness, an appeal to a kind of a racialized Jewish identity that animated Buber's Hasidic tales and his project of neo-Hasidism more broadly. So to expand on why that made him uncomfortable, I think says a lot about Kafka's own Jewish identity, and one that frankly I relate to in some ways. This is complicated stuff, right? Like as a historian, I kind of just presented Buber these racial folkish elements of Buber's thought to try to capture them as clearly as I could. But even when I stand back, right, it's uncomfortable stuff, right? Perhaps it's inspiring and enchanting in some way to imagine this sense of like collective identity and tapping into these deep roots that are sort of churning beneath the surface throughout the centuries and erupt at times. And how could we tap into that? And how could it be possible that even no matter how secularized or assimilated or modernized I am, I can always find that somewhere like deep in my core, in my body, in my bones, in my heart. Perhaps there's something beautiful about that, but also, as we know, from looking around the world today, as we know from looking at history, as we know from looking at German history, such forms of identity are dangerous. And Kafka himself had a really complicated Jewish identity, and it was an integral part of who he was, an inescapable part of who he was. But also something that he was not entirely comfortable with. What does it mean to be an individual who's also a part of a collective in this way? What does it mean to remain a free thinker, to remain creative, to remain skeptical of overly nationalistic, chauvinistic movements? There's been much discourse in the past few decades, especially the past just decade or two, about ways that Buber's thought, for all of his visions of binationalism and humanism and dialogue between Jews and Arabs in the region, ways that the folkish elements of his thought and of his Zionism actually contributed some toxic elements that took hold in the very sort of political Zionism that he saw himself as resisting against, but perhaps contributed to more substantively than he would have liked. So when we're pointing to Kafka's discomfort with the folkish elements in Buber's thought, I think some of these different pieces are at play.
Thank you very much. Ahuva asked, is it possible that Buber was trying to protect his community from retaliation by the non-Jewish outside world?
Retaliation, I'm trying to understand that, like in terms of attacks and anti-Semitism. I assume that's what that means. Yes, I think that is right. So in this era, when for generations the Ostjuden, the Eastern European Jews, had been so denigrated and thrown under the bus in the name of liberal progress, as I mentioned earlier in the talk, that was seen as the safe way for many liberal Jews from the late 18th century through the 19th century, that a safe approach to gaining citizenship and integration in the modern German state would be to say, we are not those uncultured, unrefined Eastern Jews. We are civilized Jews who exemplify what different social political conditions might do for edifying the Jewish people. That was seen as safe, right? That was seen as strategic. By the time Buber was coming around at the turn of the century, as he was entering his 20s, that was no longer seen as safe, right? That approach hadn't quite worked as planned. And so to now romanticize Eastern European Jews, right? To paint beautiful, interesting, enchanting portraits of the Ostjuden was, I think, for Buber a safer way. Let's actually just humanize Jews as they are currently, and that will help to make us safe. But at the same time, I think to emphasize that safeness and that defensive approach also does not fully appreciate the subversive element of Buber. And this is, I think, where his Zionism kicked in, which was also, I don't want the question of safety to be the primary factor in determining how we engage Jewishly and how we construct Jewish identity. There were ways that, and there were ways that perhaps Buber's engagement with Hasidism, ways in which, as I discussed, even his physical appearance started looking kind of, took on this sort of like Polish Jewish aura to it. That was also dangerous, right? And I think we have to, when we see both of those sides, what's safe and what's subversive, we can appreciate some of those dynamics in Buber's Hasidic tales vis-a-vis the anti-Jewish violence that Ahuva you mentioned.
Thank you very much. Ahuva also asked, how did you come to develop this fascinating study?
Where do I begin? When I first was formulating a dissertation topic during my PhD at the University of Chicago, working with Paul Mendez-Flor and Michael Fishbane, I at first was writing a sort of philosophical dissertation on embodiment in Buber's phenomenology of dialogue more broadly. And I started to get kind of bored. I love Torah. I love studying Jewish texts, and I found myself like writing this philosophy dissertation that was more engaged with Heidegger and Husserl than it was engaged with like the juicy Jewish sources that Buber himself was steeped in. And I've always been interested in mysticism and Hasidism. Hasidism has really become like one of my other main area of research in addition to German Jewish thought. And I realized that these dynamics of embodiment, of corporeality in Buber's thought more broadly, just caught fire in his Hasidic writings. And I realized that part of why that was because of elements within Hasidism itself, avodah begashmiut, worship in corporeality, the sort of panentheistic elements in Hasidism. I mentioned this a bit at the beginning of the paper. I realized that would actually be a most fascinating and illuminating place to study embodiment in Buber's thought, and it enabled me to spend a lot of time with Hasidic sources, kind of going back and forth between those sources, which I just frankly love studying, and Buber's engagement with them, and that sort of bifocal part of the project really is what activated it for me and keeps me interested in it still to this day as I'm finishing up the book, like almost a decade after taking on this project.
Thank you so much, Professor. There are many, many compliments in the chat room. I will send you the transcript so you can read them all and some more questions. I will now open microphones. I know there are a few questions that people would like to ask personally, and just please be kind one to another, and whoever isn't speaking, keep your mics off. And I'm sure Andrew would like to begin, so thank you very much. The microphones are open. Thank you once more, Professor Shonkoff, for a wonderful lecture, and thank you all for coming from all over the world and being with us this evening.
Thank you so much, Daron.
The mics are open. Andrew, would you like to ask your question?
I've got two questions for you, Sam. One, I am curious, are you going to cover perhaps what I think is that his other folk stories and tales and myths that he had studied as sort of preparation for him, sort of training wheels, kind of, to do the Hasidic stories that he did eventually do? Do you address that? Do you cover that sort of preliminary for the book that you're working on?
First of all, hi, Andrew. It's so good to see you. Andrew is a wonderful artist, for those of you who don't know him. And for a Buber conference I organized at Chicago for the 50th anniversary of Buber's death in 2015, Andrew has designed a font that is based on Buber's own handwriting. And we had name tag placards on the podium for all of the speakers that were in the fonts that Andrew designed. So
thank you for remembering that. Appreciate that.
It's good to see you again. Not really. I mean, I make reference for sure to his earlier collections of folk tales. And there are ways that his writings, especially on Chinese folk tales and Taoist spirituality at times is relevant for some of the phenomenological, theological issues that I'm looking at in my project. But generally, my project focuses more on the Hasidic tales, Hasidic writings, and referring more to Buber's philosophical writings as the other material.
Okay. So the second one is much shorter. So there was published at one point, after many urging from other scholars, Buber publishing his sources. A thin little booklet, pamphlet was eventually, you know what I'm talking about, that has never been translated or published anywhere in any English text. I'm curious, would you be interested in an appendix to have that available?
Yeah, that's a great idea. This was right in the back of an edition of Or HaGanuz, Buber's modern Hebrew, really modern Hebrew translations of his own German translations of Hasidic tales, largely in response to criticisms he was getting, especially from his frenemy Gershom Scholem. Buber did include it's a sort of vague, he'll write, he has a source index and writes down the sources, not with page numbers. And it's interesting because sometimes going through his notebook, the sources are sometimes different than what he put there. But there is a great volume of the Martin Buber Werkausgabe, the collected works in German,
right,
where Ron Hakohen, again, I keep referencing him because his work is extraordinary, has largely using Buber's own source index in that, also in German.
But having it in English, I think would be very valuable for other Buber scholars, undergrad and grad, to have available. I'm just suggesting that would be a good
idea. I'll think about that. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you. I'm done.
I think Esther also had a question.
Yes, if I may. So I understand that these tales were translated from the Hebrew, but I do know that originally they were published in a bilingual edition, and actually the language in which these tales would have been told in the Hasidic world and would still be told in the Hasidic world is actually Yiddish. So I was just wondering about Buber's relationship or attitudes towards the language, and if you have anything anything to add on this angle, which you haven't touched upon, and maybe because it's just irrelevant. So if that's the answer, that's also fine.
No, definitely not irrelevant, and a fascinating question. Thanks, Esther. Right. So as you mentioned, these Hasidic tales, just much like the Hasidic drasha, Hasidic sermons themselves, were overwhelmingly in Yiddish originally as oral events. I think it was Shai Agnon who actually said that until he read Buber's anthologies of Hasidic tales, he didn't even realize that those Hasidic tales were ever written down anywhere. He thought they were purely like oral bubamaises in Yiddish. So some of the texts that Buber's working with are in Yiddish. Most of them are in Hebrew, which, as you're pointing out, was already a translation. So right, so I can add to what I said before that Buber's Or HaGanuz, for example, was a modern Hebrew translation of his German tales, which were German translations of Hebrew tales, which were Hebrew translations of Yiddish events. Buber himself saw his own renditions as what he called like restoring the spokenness to the Hasidic writings. So he saw these Hebrew books, these Hebrew collections, as kind of like crude material that were already sort of estranged from the embodied fluidity and dynamism of the original events. And he elsewhere talks about Yiddish. I mean, Yiddish was his first language. Like he spoke Yiddish at home growing up, especially in his grandparents' house where he spent most of his childhood. And he has deep affection for the Yiddish language, and describes it as capturing this kind of folk element of the Jewish spirit. I do suggest in my work and that when he sees himself as restoring the orality, the spokenness to the Hasidic tales in his German texts, in fact, his German sounds like Yiddish because of just the way the Yiddish language is. His German sounds more like the Yiddish tales as they were originally spoken than the Hebrew Hasidic publications actually do. I wonder, and I suggest as a possibility that Buber, in translating those tales into German, actually saw himself as on some level like capturing some of the Yiddish ear, that Yiddish spokenness. Although I haven't seen a place where he says that explicitly, but yeah, there's the studying just the philological, like linguistic layers of these texts is a complex constellation in itself. Thanks, Esther.
Thank you very much. Karen asks, how did Buber's Hasidism influence the work of Abraham Joshua Heschel?
So although Buber encountered Hasidim in his youth, his grandfather, Solomon Buber, the famous scholar of Judaism, scholar of Midrash, used to daven in a Hasidic shtipel. Used to pray in a Hasidic synagogue, and would sometimes bring Buber there in his youth. And Buber's father brought him to that dark village of Sadagora, where Buber sort of encountered Hasidic communities sort of on the margins in his childhood. But for all intents and purposes, Buber did not grow up in the Hasidic world, and really came to it later in his 20s with a kind of like from the sidelines peering in, and was able to sort of romanticize it in various ways, partly because of that remoteness from the material. Heschel is somewhat of an inverse. Abraham Joshua Heschel himself grew up in the Hasidic world. Avraham Yoshua Heschel of Apt was one of his, the great Hasidic Rebbe, was of course one of his ancestors. And Heschel remained deeply fond of that Hasidic world, but also moved on from it in his own life, at least in terms of where he found community, intellectual community, particularly after coming to the United States, but even before that. Heschel certainly read Buber's Hasidic writings, and I sense that he was mostly frustrated by them. I mean, Art Green has a student of Heschel's, and of course a well-known theologian in his own right, suggests that Heschel in some ways was too close to Hasidism to romanticize it, and so Heschel romanticized the biblical prophets, whereas Buber was far enough from Hasidism that he was able to romanticize them. In terms of what we know about Heschel's response to Buber's writings on Hasidism, especially in relation to my project and the theme of embodiment, there's this interesting moment where Buber gave a talk at Carl Jung's Eranos Circle in Ascona, Switzerland in 1934. And it's a longer story. I actually have an article coming out in October in the Journal of Religion that's about these lectures. But to make a long story short, Buber was pushing against the kind of apolitical, sort of detached, disembodied spirituality of Jungian Gnostic spirituality this time, and really emphasized the embodied theological nature of Hasidism, and said that what Hasidism is something that is connected to concrete corporeal events in life. Like there's no distinction between spirituality and politics, right? Like you have to be present where you are and face the very like bodily being of the people around you. And that's where spirituality takes place. When Buber shared a draft of this essay with Heschel, and Heschel actually accused him of bordering on incarnational theology, of actually taking these Jewish sources and going so far into a kind of embodiment and carnality that Heschel sensed that Buber was bordering into a sort of Christian theological perspective. So that's just a fun little anecdote in terms of Heschel's response to Buber's Hasidic writings. But as is often the case, when we're looking at Buber and Heschel, or for that matter, like Buber and Scholem or Buber and Levinas, these different intellectuals at the time, they all saw one another as worlds apart. They saw each other as so different from one another. But of course, they were they were drinking the same water, and their thought was deeply correlated. And we can say the same with Heschel and Buber in that way.
Thank you very much. I want to remind you all that your microphones are open. Once again, thank you all for being here from me. You're welcome to thank the professor. Thank you again, Professor, and we'll see you all in our next event, and have a wonderful night. Laila Tov from Jerusalem.
And Boker Tov from Berkeley. Good to see all of you.
Very. I was wondering where you are. Thank you.
Yes, I am in California. I teach at the Graduate Theological
I'm in
Union.
Pittsburgh.
Ah,
Merci beaucoup depuis Paris.
de rien. Dial. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam,
you.
so much.